Strength and honor.
That's right. That means it is time for Gladiator II. So in this episode, we're talking about Ridley Scott and Gladiator II. This is Alex from Los Angeles.
And this is Karan from Los Angeles. Welcome to Movies That Shaped Us. We're two longtime friends who grew up on opposite ends of the globe with very different backgrounds, but we're both shaped and are still being shaped by the movies we see and love. In each episode, we cover a filmmaker who shaped our love of movies. Join us as we explore why they matter and review the three movies in their filmography that made the biggest impact on us. So yeah, this is a big one and timely because guess what? I ran into Paul Mescal today at a bakery. So I am like ready for this.
You're ready for this. Did you ask him to come on as a guest? We could have our first guest.
Oh, so many thoughts after I said goodbye. I was like, oh, could I have done that? Should I have taken a photo? This and that I didn't do. But I at least talked to him. I never do that. I mean,
Wow.
if listeners are listening to this, like this happens, right?
Yeah.
But I don't normally never engage with anybody because they're out there in the private time.
Right.
But also, usually I run into like older people, more senior actors or filmmakers. But this is the first time I've run into somebody who's such a like current star of the moment. And the reason I even talked to him was because I was listening to an interview of his on a podcast on my walk.
Whoa.
So, and then he was behind me. So that's why I said, I'm so sorry. I don't normally do this, but I have to show you. And I whipped out my phone and showed him his name on this podcast that I was listening to. So he laughed and we had a chuckle about it. And then I said, yeah,
unbelievable. That is so funny.
Exactly. And Paul and I, we are best friends now. So,
Nice. Maybe he'll come on to a future episode.
Exactly. And he was wearing his, classic short shorts. If anybody wants to know, I thought that was an internet meme, but it's true.
Oh, okay. Nice. Okay, we're confirming myths about Paul Mescal today. What a big episode.
But this is not about Mescal. It's about Ridley. Do you want to start by sharing your thoughts on Ridley Scott and what he means to you and all of that?
Yeah. So, Sir Ridley, I guess we need to say, because he's the first person I think that we've covered that has been knighted. Yes, Sir Ridley Scott. And this was a pretty interesting as I thought about him. He is someone who, and I mean, we'll talk about this more kind of when we get into our individual picks, but I never really thought about him much as a kid, to be honest. Like when I was first coming up and getting into film in high school, he was not like a director that I would think about or really even kind of knew. I mean, even the movie that was the first one that I saw of his, which we'll talk about as his masterpiece, Alien. I wouldn't like see that movie and be like, oh my God, who's this director? I got to immediately go and see everything that he's done. It was more the film just blew me away and still does. But it wasn't until the first Gladiator movie, which we'll also talk about after the second one, that I realized like, oh wow, this guy, like, who is he? What has he done? And then went back and saw it a very storied career. But his filmography obviously was intimidating. And he was someone even then after that, after I was like, oh cool, Gladiator, what else has he done? I looked at this, I'm like, oh, I mean, yeah, obviously Blade Runner, Alien, Thelma and Louise, but it's not like he has a Spielberg filmography. So I honestly at the time kind of chalked him up to just like a journeyman filmmaker, like a gun for hire. He's not really an auteur. He makes, some successful movies, some not successful movies. And I never really thought too much about him, though I'd see his films every so often. Like I'd see his big historical epics because that's what I identified with him after Gladiator. But it wasn't until 3 years ago, it was actually during the pandemic or right after it. I can't remember exactly which year. I basically made myself a New Year's resolution to just watch all of Ridley Scott's films. He has like close to 30 films now. And I'm like, you know what? This is someone who people keep saying, oh, he's my favorite director and talking about this guy as this great auteur. And I'm like, I've never really seen that. So I did go back and watch all of his movies. And it did actually open my eyes a lot to this guy does have like themes and throughout his films, a particular worldview that he toys with every single one of his movies, which to me makes an auteur and a very distinct visual style that we'll talk about more when we get into him. But he now is, after doing that exercise, and I feel like I now am more attuned to just this master that is still with us and still making films into his late 80s. And even something like Gladiator II, which we'll get into more in depth, like pulling something like that off, even just on the scale, and coming right off of Napoleon that we talked about in a previous episode recently. The scale at which he films is just, I think it's actually like second to none in terms of directors working today. And he still can pull it off at his age. So I now have a much more profound like respect for him as a filmmaker, a love of his movies, a lot of hidden gems I discovered, films I went back and rewatched, and like, oh wow, now I can see this master at work, even though at the time, again, I kind of wrote him off as like a, no offense to journeyman filmmakers, but like a Ron Howard or a Jon Favreau or like a Gore Verbinski, who sometimes makes great movies, but I don't think of them as artists. And now I really do think of Sir Ridley as an artist, and I will be there opening weekend to every single one of his films, which hopefully he'll have a lot more to come. He seems to be very prolific as well, which is pretty cool. So that it's been my whole evolution over the last basically 24 years since seeing the first Gladiator movie on Ridley, and I've definitely come around, and now I would put him in, my top 15 or 10 or so filmmakers of all time. So that's where I am now on Sir Ridley. What about you? What is your relationship to Ridley over the years?
That's amazing to hear. Maybe the opposite. Well, not quite, but in some ways. But growing up in India, I think watching Gladiator is one of my first like distinct memories of watching a big Hollywood movie.
Ah.
And instantly watching like making of videos and how he did the sets and how he kind of used a set of real people and then replicated them to fill out the Coliseum arena. Like I have a memory of watching that. So I think he, to me, I don't even know what auteur theory was because I wasn't watching any of other, great world cinema auteur movies. I was mostly watching Bollywood movies, but he really sort of stood out because this is the first time where I think I really took note into how a director was really bringing something of this massive scale to life and doing it so well in a powerful kind of way. So that's one. And number two, as a kid, I remember going to some other people's home for like a dinner party or something, and all the kids as usual were in like a bedroom with the television on while the adults are having dinner or whatever,
right,
chatting. And there's a older guy, still a kid, maybe a teenager, we were much younger, who had control of the TV and the remote control. So he had an Alien VHS.
Oh yeah.
And I have like distinct like visual memory of the Alien popping up on this like really tiny screen, being scared by, but also being totally drawn to it. So it's that, and then T1. I think those are the two movies from my childhood time, like representing Hollywood, and that made a pretty indelible mark. So in some ways, like Ridley has been in my consciousness of movies like for a long time, like early impressions of Hollywood movies. But as I grew older, I don't think I've done, certainly not the homework that you've done. I kind of watched all of his movies, but because of that early impression, I've always been aware and wanted to check out whatever he's done since. And I think I've seen most of his noteworthy stuff, the stuff that's worked, the stuff that also has not worked. And I think at the end of it, I do agree with you. I come on the same impression of him that he's a true master, he's a true artist. Nobody in our living lifetime is actually doing the stuff that he does at the scale he does. Like, I don't think we get Nolan if we don't have Sir Ridley. And Nolan has said that himself, actually, that how much he admires him. And we often sort of, think about the David Leans and the Spielbergs kind of and the Kubricks passing the baton to Nolan. But actually, I think Ridley is a pretty important piece of that puzzle. And I don't even think of Nolan movies to be that, grand in terms of their vision and scale, because they're not dealing with like a bajillion extras and historic sets that are being created, a lot of stuff that's happening literally on the field. Nobody's doing that. And the fact that he's able to do that at his age, to your point, is kind of remarkable. Nobody else can do that. But the other thing that I feel like in rewatching his movies in preparation for the podcast it struck me, and I'm curious to get your take on this, is that I think because of his roots in artistry and storytelling, visual storytelling, and he's famously storyboards everything, I think the thing that attracts him the most is the process of movie making and putting up these big set pieces than the story development and certainly the character development. And it's interesting to me that the movies that really sing and come together fully are the ones where the story and the characters are also about the process and nothing much more than that. Because then his style and his view of the world, I think, lends itself very well. Versus stories that have more inert characters that need to be fleshed out and developed, or the story is not about the process, it's something about more something elusive or bigger, that's where things don't quite fully come together. And I've been thinking a lot about this because over the last several years, like, people have panned Gucci and Napoleon and all of that. And I've actually been a defender of all those movies because I kind of like them. But then I also was thinking about, why don't these movies have any lasting impact? Spoiler alert, I have similar feelings about Gladiator 2 as well, in bits and pieces. And although I do think it's more successful than a lot of those other movies, it's because of that thing, is that they emotionally, from a character development standpoint, don't fully come together. Because guess what? He's not interested in that. And I kind of respect that, but I'm also disappointed by it, because a lot of these movies at this scale, who nobody's doing, with A-list star cast, A-list department heads, they come short because he's not interested in the rest of the stuff. So that's my kind of current thesis. And I get it. Maybe it's something about getting older, maybe he feels like, how many of these do I have left in me, So let's get them done. No fuss. I know where to put my 12 cameras. I know where to assemble the 5,000 extras that I have in my bag. We'll think about the rest of the stuff, the story and the character development and all of that later in the editing room. It'll be fine. That's the vibe I get. And frankly, it's disappointing to me a little bit, as much as I admire him and what he's doing. So that's where I'm at with him.
Yeah, so on the visual style piece, I think he's one of the, and I might not be actually accurate about this, but he's at least one of the early people to come from commercial directing and advertising.
Yep.
And that actually might be why, which you have to storyboard out that, because
Right.
there's brand considerations and those sorts of things. So I wonder if that is why he
Exactly.
continues that, process. And you have to be scrappy on a commercial too. And like you said, like to give listeners education on how he films very fast for what he's able to
Yeah.
do, the number of weeks.
No takes, retakes.
Right, he
Nothing.
has many cameras set up. He knows exactly what he's doing, so he can make films like Gladiator II and Napoleon very, very quickly, where a lot of directors could take, months and months and months to do something that complicated. So maybe that does come from his commercial background. And I do also think, in terms of his visual style, to me at least, his movies are some of the movies that, and I mean this in a good way, look incredibly expensive. I know
Oh, yeah.
Gladiator 2 did,
Always.
cost a lot of money, but it looks incredibly expensive in the best ways. I think the only other director who gets close to this in my mind is James Cameron, who every cent is on the screen. It's not like you watch some comedy and it's like, how did this thing cost like $150 million? Like, it doesn't look like it. Even if the movie isn't as compelling to me, at least the spectacle is there. And that's what I love about Ridley's work. And in terms of the themes of the film, so I used to, or I would, like in the beginning, sort of, again, feel that like the story wasn't really his thing and there isn't anything that kind of connects his movies together. But it was on this rewatch, or not rewatch, the filmography thing that I did a couple years back, that each one of these stories seemed to be very much about a character who has a very specific set of rules or a worldview, and then immediately is tested. And that worldview either falls apart and he or she has to find a completely new one because of some incident that happens, or they survive through whatever experience that the narrative is putting them through because they hold fast to whatever that code is. Whether it's Maximus in terms of his strength and honor code and has to then, adhere to that to get revenge. Or The Martian, I guess, is another example, another movie we're going to be talking about, right? Or, they have to throw the entire thing away and just totally rebuild their entire world existence. And I sort of was seeing this in a lot of the movies I was watching. And then I realized like that is sort of some thread through his films. And yes, it is simplistic in terms of it's a test, right? Characters go through a test. And I don't know where this necessarily comes from in terms of his background or why putting your worldview at challenge because of not necessarily always survival like a White Squall or a Martian, but could be even just from a narrative standpoint, having to survive something and what that does to what you thought the world looked like. So that was what, to me, I was like, okay, well, there is actually something that is a theme beyond the visual style that to me like makes his filmography like actually richer. And some of the movies that I didn't necessarily really like when I first saw them, like a G.I. Jane, it just, I don't know, there's something about it elevated it to me a little bit. How that being said, though, I agree that the weaker films of his are when that isn't interesting enough. Like maybe the main character's not interesting, or the challenges he or she's going through isn't interesting enough, so that all you're left with is the spectacle. And when it really works,
Exactly.
like an Alien or Gladiator or Martian or Blade Runner or Last Duel, these are all films where the story elements are so interesting and what the characters are going through, and that test is super fascinating. Then it's a complete picture. So I do think there's something there. To me, it's just how much of that is simple versus more interesting from a narrative standpoint. And when it's not that interesting, it's there, but the movie is not as successful because he definitely does have a very inconsistent, I'll say,
Oh yeah.
filmography. I mean, he's made some of the best movies ever, and he's made some movies that are like, wow, like what is this? Like, what did I just sit through with like Exodus, Gods and Kings, or
Oh my gosh, yeah.
1492? Like these movies, I'm like, geez, like this Hannibal, they just don't work at all. So he's very
Hmm.
inconsistent. And maybe that is because, like you said, he's so focused. Okay, I know how I can do Robin Hood, so let me just kind of go through the motions of it, and hopefully we'll find a story there that's interesting. And that movie, another one was that just didn't work because I didn't really care about what Robin Hood was trying to, this lord was going through and being tested and realizing, do I want to be an outlaw or not? And then, spoiler alert, at the end, he becomes Robin in the last 10 minutes.
Right.
So I think
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right. It just I guess I can appreciate sometimes that more after having watched all of his movies and really just like marinated in Ridley for a period of like 3 months than at least I did when I first started knowing who he was and following along with his films.
Yeah. No, I see that too, because I think that's what I mean by the process is like there's a challenge up front. And sometimes that challenge slash process of
Hmm.
unraveling or surviving the challenge is interesting and sometimes it's not.
Right.
But I think it does start from, it seems to me, from the storyboards and what can I put on the screen visually that would be arresting and almost like a fun challenge to do. And the rest
Hmm.
of it is sort of a way to get to that place. And then it's interesting, like how the actors operate too, because if the challenge and the process is interwoven in the movie and its story, the characters have a lot more to unmine, in terms of
Hmm.
their own character development. Because I don't think they're getting much from Ridley or the script.
Hmm.
Sometimes he's worked with really good script writers, so it's probably
Right.
on the page,
Hmm.
but often it isn't. But then movies where the story is not about that process, or the process, to your point, is not that interesting, then
Right.
even the greatest of actors don't really have much to mine from. And they're doing their best. And
Hmm.
that's why in these last few movies, we see like often the complaint is that everybody's in a different movie. It's because there's not much on the page. The actors are left to basically make something of these characters, and that's where you're getting totally different styles, which
Hmm.
I actually kind of enjoy. But the point is that the movie then doesn't stick with you. It doesn't have that everlasting impact. So it's interesting, and I'm kind of amazed that this is the kind of cultural cachet he's amassed, that he keeps getting big checks
Yeah.
or even blank checks to make these movies that sort of come together. And I think it's because of people have name recognition, admire him, and he's earned it. And like we've been saying, there's nobody else working at that epic scale, that each of these movies have the potential of becoming an event, which we
Right.
desperately want, and
Hmm.
people for the most part do show up, whether they end up doing well, in the end or no, that's a different question because they're all pretty expensive. But
Right.
at least there's anticipation. Like how many movies people even are aware of right now? They just come and go. It doesn't matter who's in them.
Exactly.
But a Ridley movie, I don't think is ever ignored, I would say.
No, that's definitely true, especially like in the last, I think since Gladiator, honestly, that is, I think, really what put him on the map
Yeah,
in terms of blockbusters, and that career he's had in the last 24 years is a lot
right.
more, a Ridley Scott film as opposed to he had some fallow periods in the 80s and 90s where I don't think it was a big deal when like Black Rain came out or these other smaller
No,
movies that just didn't resonate. But definitely now he's just amazing at his age that he's able to still keep doing this and wants to. He's like, I'm gonna keep making movies. Like I'm not gonna retire.
totally.
It's not like a Quentin Tarantino thing where I have one more in me. So I think it was exciting to see what's coming up. Let's get into his latest film now. Gladiator 2 just came out. So the IMDb plot summary: after his home is conquered by the tyrannical emperors who now lead Rome, Lucius is forced to enter the Colosseum and must look to the past to find strength to return the glory of Rome to its people. Obviously, Ridley Scott directed, starring Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, and Pedro Pascal. So we'll get into Gladiator. Spoiler alert, just for the episode. We'll talk about the first Gladiator movie in a little bit because it is we both put it on our list. But I'll just do a brief summary. I love the film. I watch it, at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. Actually, watched
Oh
it twice
wow.
in the last week. So I watched it once before the new movie and then once after the new movie because I just love Gladiator. So those are my thoughts on the first Gladiator. We'll get into more of them. So I definitely was a movie though that I was not anticipating. Never thought this would get made. obviously the first Gladiator ends with, spoiler alert, Maximus dying, so it doesn't leave much room for another story. But when I did see that he was coming back to this and saw Denzel Washington, being cast in the film, I was like, okay, this is cool. Like Ridley doing another Roman epic, which I'm a huge fan of sword and sandal movies. I love films set in the classical period. So I came into this with, a little bit of skepticism, but also anticipation. And at the end of the day, is it as good as the first Gladiator? No. Are there things in the film that definitely don't work? Yes, which I'll get into when we get into it more. But I really enjoyed this movie. I think the things that work outweigh the things that don't for me, and I thought it was a very interesting take that in the first film, it really is just a personal story of revenge and Maximus's journey. That's what grounds the movie. That's what you care about. And yes, there's sort of political statements and political machinations in the background about what is Rome and the Senate. And this movie flipped those two things, where the politics was really the A story and the personal vendettas of the other characters was really the B stories, which I thought the B stories were not very interesting. Like, I didn't really care about Paul Mescal's character very much or what he was kind of going through. And same thing with Pedro Pascal. But I really cared about Denzel Washington and the politics. So the fact that was the A story for me made the movie interesting and fun. And I got a lot out of it. And we'll talk more about, that piece of it. But overall, solid film. What about you? What are your first thoughts after exiting the Coliseum of Gladiator 2?
Yeah, same as you. Like, I wasn't like waiting for this. I have not watched Gladiator as many times as you have. I probably had watched it once or twice, maybe, and then I watched it for in preparation for this podcast. So I wasn't waiting for the sequel, but there's something about knowing that Ridley's going back to that era is always exciting because nobody else can pull that off, as we've said.
No way.
And then the cast is amazing. Like, obviously Denzel, but Paul Mescal, like I watched his TV show Normal People in 2020, and he's just absolutely amazing in it. And I've sort of followed his career since. Like whatever he does is really, really singular. Like we are living in this age of this new fresh talent, like Chalamet and Austin Butler and Barry Keoghan and all these new people. But I think Paul Mescal sort of has this really deep, sensitive, almost like a Dustin Hoffman like energy in the body and look of like Marlon Brando. So he's sort of that kind of classical actor, but with just like a lot of silent emotional depth to him. So for me, that was very interesting that, he's going to be in this big sort of tentpole movie because he's been like an indie kind of actor so far, which didn't surprise me because I knew the moment I watched Normal People that this guy is going to explode and is going to have a very interesting career. So all of that I was really looking forward to. And I agree. I think the movie is solid. Like I really had a great time watching it. Like you're not bored. Are you entertained? Hell you are,
Right.
The entire movie.
Right.
And you're right. Like I think it's the politics that takes center stage. I will say that I enjoyed the movie more when I was watching it as opposed to when I've more deeply thought about it. Because that's when the holes of the movie start to emerge. And I thought Paul was very good given what he was given. And this sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier is that I think Ridley's more interested in the process, and politics and the politicking is the process. And you have Denzel, who's sort of the driver and the agent of that. And that's why that part, that performance, and that character are the most interesting. And not to take any credit away from Denzel, like he's obviously one of the greatest actors of this generation, any generation. And it's fun to see him take like a fun, juicy part like this and absolutely relish in it.
Oh, yeah.
But the part is also kind of in service of what Ridley is interested in versus the rest of the pieces he's not that interested in, and I'm not the one about historical inaccuracies, whatever, who cares? Like this is a movie, like grow up. But I think what I do care about is that the characters' motivations and such like really land. And I think the core theme, spoiler alert, if you've not seen the movie, of Lucius, played by Paul Mescal, finding out that he's Maximus's son, his mother finding that out, and how that union happens, and how this pain is sort of driving him for kind of bringing back Marcus Aurelius as his grandfather's dream. Like all of that, it's said out loud to us, but it's not deeply felt. And it's not the fault of Paul Mescal as a performance. It's just not in the script, I think. There is one person who I will put the blame on in addition to Ridley is Connie Nielsen. I think she's perfectly fine as an actress, But I think the emotional center of the movie, apart from all the politicking, is her and this relationship that, oh, she let her son go away, he's come back, and what happens from there on out, and how the son who was against the Roman Empire and wanting to attack the Roman Empire now has to kind of flip because of his love for her mother, who he just found out, and the fact that he is the grandfather of Marcus Aurelius. Like, there's a lot of emotional sort of pain in that as a center, which Connie Nielsen has to convey, and that just doesn't land at all. And those beats are kind of skipped really fast. That, oh, we are son now. Oh, we are together now. Oh, this is happening. And again, I don't even care about the story. It's if it was just conveyed in the performance, and if Ridley had just given a little bit more breath to it, it would have kind of landed, I think. Having said that, I think it was fun to see the gladiator, in this case, Paul Mescal, being the underdog. He's bitter. He's kind of cocky, but making fun of all of Rome and all of that. His physicality is great. Like, you really see how, like, kind of grungy and dirty and burnt up and all of that is really communicated. It's just that the crescendo of him kind of rising to being this, chapter of hope for Rome and uniting everybody, that just doesn't fully land. And I don't think it's his fault. It's just we don't get there. Ridley does just is not really interested in that, which is a bit of a bummer. I'm curious how you felt about that.
No, I agree with you, except I do kind of put it on Mescal. I mean, I've never seen him in a movie before or
Mm,
anything. This is my first introduction to him. I know that he's
mm,
very big on Twitter, not like as a tweeter, but people are like, falling over this
right.
guy. So I'm like, okay, let's see what he have. And I don't blame him in the sense of I think he didn't do a bad job. I just think he doesn't have the gravitas to pull off what this movie needs because there isn't much there with the story. And we'll talk about Gladiator when we get to it, but that was is I think one of the best examples of a movie where the stars align for someone to turn into a global superstar with one performance, and Russell Crowe delivers that because he is just has the gravitas of that. And I found Paul Mescal to be a weak link in this movie where he just didn't pop for me. And a lot of it, I think you're right, is the storyline's not really
It's
that
a
interesting.
story.
But
Yeah.
an actor of more star power, I think, could have still carried at least my attention. Because again, I didn't know who this guy was. And I'll also say kind of the same thing a little bit for Pedro Pascal, who I know also is an actor who's really worshipped a lot. I think he's fine as an actor. I'm not like worshiping him at the feet of him like a lot of
No.
other people do. I know he has a big moment, and he also did a better job, but still I felt like the wattage really wasn't there on these two leads. And maybe that's another reason why I just gravitated towards the Denzel stuff, because he is just killing it. And I found
Yeah.
that part of the movie a lot more interesting. And I think to your point, that was really clearly found more interesting because that was what got
Yeah.
the better actors. I don't think they got more screen time, but just more more excitement was going on when it came to like,
Exactly.
okay, how is Denzel, who is this character kind of in the shadows, plotting to basically take over Rome, overthrow the two emperors there, create the chaos and the conditions that are necessary for a coup, essentially, is what he's doing. And you can see it in just the way that he watches, the subtlety of how he moves through the room, who he's talking to, just his stares, which is, he's so good at that anyway. But the
Yeah.
way that he's looking at each of the characters and deciding, okay, well, I can use this person. This person can be my instrument, like he says in one scene with Paul Mescal, and that part of the movie really works. Honestly, it was kind of like you strip out the other storylines about Lucius and trying to connect it back to the first movie. I think the movie would have been really amazing if it was
I'm with you.
just
Just
like
make it
how
about the
Denzel.
political machinations.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
it feels forced. And even with Pedro, like, he's not given anything to do. He barely even has anything to say in those coup scenes with the
right.
Senate people. Like,
Hmm.
he's not given a line. He's just looking.
Right.
So I don't know. I blame it on Ridley and the script. Like, they didn't give these guys much to do. But
Hmm.
despite that, the fact that at least Paul comes through and is sort of simmering anger and rage. It's a different kind of rage. Like, I've
Hmm.
seen people communicate, oh, where's the rage? I don't see the rage. I'm like, rage doesn't just mean yelling all the time. You can
Right.
see
Right.
this person is like burnt and hurt. I think
Hmm.
that comes across really well. All the physical arm to arm kind of combat scenes, like the one
Yes.
with the Twin Kings in the first introduction, absolutely amazing. Like, you really
Yes.
believe that this guy has that power. It's just that it's just not allowed to go to a different level when he's kind of uniting everybody. And that's, I think, because of the story and also how it's filmed, right? Like I was comparing it again, one shouldn't, but you can't help it. But Russell's Gladiator speeches, the way they're shot, the camera is on him.
Hmm.
He's center stage versus here, they are wide shots. You hear Paul, but you don't really see his how he's kind of really summoning everybody's attention and love and respect and all of
Right.
that. So they're not shot the same way. And then I guess we have to talk about all the special effectry and such. Like all the practical sets are obviously amazing. Like he literally built Rome, it seems
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
But as good as the CGI stuff is as compared to what we've been seeing lately in like tentpole movies, it's definitely better. But you're still very aware of all of that. And I think in the moment it's kind of fun, I suppose. But it is distracting. The
Oh,
you
you
know
felt the
the
CG was distracting?
Yeah, the
Oh.
baboons, the rhinos, the sharks, like it's a bit much, I again to your point, I would have maybe cut out one of those things. Like there's enough going on as a spectacle anyway with all these people, and you built a coliseum and everything. I don't think you need so much of this. It's distracting in my mind.
Yeah, well, what I think they were doing, especially after watching Gladiator before and after this movie, in terms of
Yeah.
the depiction of Rome, I felt was really interesting. So in the first movie, they talk, Rome is sort of this majestic, very amazing sort of musical cues when they show Rome, and it's this idyllic place. And okay, there's this one
Right.
bad actor of Commodus, but Rome is amazing. And in this movie, Rome is shown as a like opulent, kind of falling apart metropolis. There's scenes of
Right.
homeless people everywhere. You see
Right.
people in the crowds holding up flowers and incense to their noses, which they used to do back then because the city stank. There was
Right.
no perfume or anything like that. So you saw people doing that. The rooms filled with incense. Obviously, the riots and things happen. And I think the opulence and the sort of over the topness of the Colosseum battles and the baboons and all these things just lead to a city that is so opulently corrupted that it needs to kind of be taken down. It's like Rome is actually the bad guy in this movie as opposed to something that just
Right.
has one bad person in there. It is, even the beginning, I was sitting there watching this movie in the beginning of the film, and there's a scene where Paul Mescal is defending his city in Africa from the invading Romans. And again, we'll talk about the Gladiator movie. There's a scene in Gladiator. The first one opens with the Romans attacking it's a
Right.
German tribe, and I'm like, yeah, Romans, in the first movie, Romans, I love you, amazing. One of my favorite moments in movie history is that opening battle sequence. And in this movie, like Rome is bad. They're shown
Yeah.
as like these invading forces, and it's just a very
Yep.
interesting flip between the two films in that sense. And I think that goes into this over the top opulence that they had. And obviously, the performances by the emperors are like Joaquin Phoenix's Commodus with no subtlety. It's like, let's remove all the subtlety.
I love them actually.
I
They're
love them
pretty
too.
fun.
I'm not at all saying that as a knock, but it's like he's
Yeah.
dialing all these things up. So to me, the
Yeah.
ridiculousness of, I mean, sharks in the Coliseum obviously was not real, but I don't care.
No, I
I mean, it's
get
like the
that.
symbol
It
of
just
that,
doesn't look good,
Oh,
is what
okay,
I'm
okay,
saying.
okay. The quality of the effects. Okay.
It
Yep.
doesn't look good.
For some reason, for me, it worked. And even the first movie, I remember got a lot of criticism about times like bad CGI. And at the time, I don't remember it being that way. And to me, it still holds up. So maybe for some reason, through the Ridley lens, like I'm more forgiving.
I don't know. To me, the hair, I understand why they were doing it to your point,
Hmm.
but it just felt a little distracting because they just didn't look super good. I preferred the more hand-to-hand combat stuff because
Yes.
that felt just so tactile, so real,
Different
and
than the first one
and
too,
different
which I
too.
which I
Yeah,
loved. Like it felt more like a brawl than,
yeah,
Russell Crowe's character is obviously a soldier, so he's very
yeah.
well trained. And Mescal, I mean, he's a soldier too, kind of, but not in like the Roman army. It
No,
seemed like he's more of like just a warrior because he's so angry,
he's a
right? Even
brute.
when he and
Yeah,
as a brute, right? And I liked those scenes a lot, like you mentioned. And just one more thing, most disappointing thing to me actually was the score. I
I
felt
know.
just again coming after Gladiator, which I think is one of the
It's
best movie scores of all time.
non-existent.
The only moments that I remembered were when they would do the cues to the old Gladiator theme, and
Right.
those I remember. But I definitely felt the score was lacking and probably the most disappointing parts of the film. But like I said, overall, I was in a way kind of
Yeah,
pleasantly surprised in following Gladiator that it wasn't a total disaster. I actually do want to see it a second time in theaters, which is rare
I
for me
would
this year.
too.
Right now, it's in his top 10 Ridley Scott films for me. I put it at the bottom half of the top 10, but still right in there.
Yeah, I definitely recommend it. I will say of all the stuff that he's been doing the last like 10 years or so, I think this one comes together at that scale the most, maybe barring one exception, The Last Duel, which is just brutal. And it's the process movies of all process movies because you're literally seeing the same story from so many angles. And
Yeah.
that's really why my theory clicked in because, like, oh, this works because it's in the design of the movie. But yeah, the same flaws are here too. People are in different movies. All of that stuff is sort of not coming together. So, but I still highly recommend it. I think everybody should see the movie, and it's fun to kind of connect it with the old one.
I definitely think so too.
Like it's a true sequel. I've been hearing that, oh, it's the same story redrudged. I don't think so. I think like this conversation has proven there's a lot more meat on the bone. He's flipped the script in many ways. I think it's pretty interesting, I would say. In fact, like you said, and like we both said, like if it were more about just the politicking, it would even be a more daring, or this is not my take. Like I heard this on a podcast. Like, what if Lucius, who turns and becomes kind of a quote unquote sort of good guy who's after like valor and all of that, what if he was just brutish and selfish and just wanted to decimate Rome through the entire thing
No,
and
like a bad
gets
guy in a way.
like a bad guy and really becomes Denzel Washington character's like right hand person, and maybe they become victorious together, or they sort of become so power hungry that they have to kind of take each other down at the end because there's only room for one. Like there's so
Oh,
many
that's interesting.
ways to do this.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it didn't have to be about strength and honor, to be honest, because that's Russell's motto. There's no, it sort of feels shoehorned in this story actually. I will say another thing I should have mentioned up top, which is that Ridley loves a head chop.
Yeah,
He loves a head chop. Every movie has a head chop, pretty much.
Yeah, great violence in this movie. I thought even dialed up from the first movie. I really
Oh
enjoyed
yeah.
the violence, especially to Denzel at the end. That hand-to-hand
Oh,
fight when he gets his arm cut off is just amazing. Just
it's
awesome.
chop, chop, chop all the way.
Now let's get on to the rest of Ridley's career. These are our top three. So what we're gonna do is something we do every episode. So we bring in three films that each of us, for us, represent Ridley Scott. So the first movie we'll talk about is our first love. This is the one movie that first made us fall in love with Ridley Scott or recognize who he was. Next is the masterpiece, the movie that Ridley's made that has sort of touched us personally the most. And then finally, the wild card. This is another movie that's important to us for another way. Maybe Ridley took a chance on something. Maybe it's a hidden gem. Maybe it's something a little outside of the box that worked for him or really didn't work. And those are the three movies that we will discuss. And let's get into First Loves, which is going to be the same for both of us here, which is the first Gladiator film. So we talked about Gladiator 2. Let's dive into the first Gladiator. So, Karan, why don't you break down the movie for folks in case they haven't seen it, and then we'll get into your thoughts on why this is your first love of Ridley Scott.
Okay, so Gladiator from 2000, directed by Ridley Scott, obviously starring Russell Crowe, Joaquin Phoenix, Connie Nielsen. Quick logline: a former Roman general sets out to exact vengeance against the corrupt emperor who murdered his family and sent him into slavery. I feel like we've already teased a lot about the movie, so I wouldn't repeat kind of my association as to how I came upon it because we already talked about that. But I think this is, in rewatching it after a very long time, it kind of felt like a perfectly captured movie that Ridley could have made, and for him a pretty deserving like acknowledgement of his talents, I think. And as a Best Picture winner, even though this movie is not looked upon as a very favorable Best Picture winner, but I think I defend it after this watch. And I would even go as far as saying that in many ways, this movie feels like a bit of a wild card for Ridley. And I say this because this is maybe one of the few movies I've seen from him that has heart in it.
Mm-hmm.
It is a process movie. It is something that happens in the beginning that then sets in motion the rest of the film, like we've been talking, and it's executed perfectly. All the Ridley things of scale, set pieces, departments coming together across the board, from sets and music to costumes, visual effects, all that is there. But that's there in all Ridley movies that are good. I think this one is sort of above the rest of them because it has a lot of heart in it. And a lot of that credit has to go to the score, I think, the way it's teased. And I don't know what came upon Ridley. Maybe he was in a different phase of his life. I don't know if he was in a relationship. I don't know if he has kids or no, but there was something else going on where he seems to be a little bit more interested in deeper ideas of relationships and the cost of, vengeance and the damage that it does, and the unsaid love between two people, in this case Connie Nielsen's character and Russell Crowe, or son and a mother, or the toxic relationship between brother and sister. Like, I've not seen relationships and heart being prioritized in a Ridley movie. And this is why this movie is elevated from the rest of them. And that's why it's the Best Picture winner.
One note of that, maybe the relationship piece, the actress who plays Russell Crowe's wife, who gets killed in the beginning, is Ridley Scott's wife. So maybe that's why. I don't know.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I learned that for the first time last week. That aside, like, for me, because I know you gave sort of your intro on this movie, like this movie I first saw when it came out, because again, as a big fan of just Roman epics, and saw it I think 3 or 4 times in the theater, like immediately was just like, this movie is amazing. I think you mentioned on our previous podcast that for you, like, moving into a new apartment, you put on Julie and Julia, right? To like kind of break into a new place. For me, it's Gladiator. I have to watch this movie any new place that I move, and especially when I get a new TV or a new sound equipment for my, surround sound system. The first 10 minutes of Gladiator, I have to put on.
Ultimate test.
It is the ultimate test. That's the ultimate AV test for me. And sometimes I'll just sort of be late at night and I want to sleep. I'll just put on that scene and watch it and feel just like invigorated with life. So I've loved this movie from the beginning, but it's interesting because at the time I was sort of the mind, like you said, about why is this a Best Picture nominee? It's just a big popcorn movie. I was very kind of upset that it didn't win that year. I thought it should be Steven Soderbergh's Traffic, because I was, a little annoying sort of like film geek at that time. But over the years, when again I watch this at least once a year, I think this movie, like you said, does deserve to be Best Picture, not only because of those things you talked about, the theme just of the love that Russell Crowe has for his wife, and it's really just about that, about how that can wound you, the longing for it, and the realization that, okay, I'm gonna die because I want to be reunited with my wife and my son, but I have to have this vengeance, and that it's the love that is driving that vengeance. It's also that, like, the scale at which this movie was made on, and it looks expensive, it looks great, high craft at every sort of point, and it does bring back this type of film that was not made at the time. People were not making these large scale historical ancient Roman sword and sandal epic pictures anymore. And he did bring that back for maybe 5 or 6 years, or a lot of, kind of knockoffs of Gladiator. I enjoyed some of them,
bad ones, including some made by him.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, though I will stand behind Kingdom of Heaven. If the director's cut of that is just blows the doors off. But yes, I think it did change Hollywood in a way. But I think it goes back to not only the performances being amazing and why it deserves to be this Best Picture winner, but also, like you said, the themes. So I've sort of actually come around on this movie of being proud that it won Best Picture, and actually think it's one of the best representatives of Hollywood filmmaking of this century. And I'm glad that it's up there. But for me, this movie is, again, one of my favorites. And like I mentioned at the outset, I'd seen definitely Alien before I saw this. Maybe that might have been the only Ridley Scott movie I think I actually had seen before this one. But that movie did not make me want to research who this director was and kind of sort of be like, okay, I'm going to sign up for every Ridley Scott movie that's made because I saw Alien. But this one definitely caught my attention. And for a while there, I was following his career until he kind of went into a slump for a while. And then I kind of drifted off and didn't only kind of came back to fill in those gaps. So this is definitely the one that like made me stand up and say, okay, who directed this? Because this is something like I have not seen on this scale before from the year 2000. Like it throws back to, like you had said earlier, a lot of like kind of David Lean scale and grand journey and historical figures. So I love it. Every part of it. I don't think there's anything to me that is like underwhelming, especially I'll just shout out again, like we mentioned several times, the Hans Zimmer score is just out of this world. And it really, the second movie is lacking that wallop that this first movie brings in.
And the way it's threaded throughout. And then finally at the end, when you hear that song, I even thinking about it gives me chills.
Oh yeah.
And how it's sort of connected to, his wife and kid are they're in heaven or whatever, and this feels, and that whole music, it just sort of ties the whole movie so beautifully and sort of pushes it to a different level in my mind, because you could still have an epic movie with all of those departments singing, but if that level of heart was not in it, it just wouldn't land in this fashion, and that's why it stays, and it has stayed in the culture. And I haven't watched it, but clearly you have so many times, and I'm sure others have too. It takes us back to maybe what the Oscars was started for, to reward blockbuster filmmaking with art come together, and art not just in like technical crafts sense, but also something that has something else to say, right? A message or an emotion or what have you. And so, yeah, it's actually a very classical Best Picture winner, I think.
Yeah, I've come around to that fact, even though, again, at the time I was like, it
Yeah.
should be Traffic as a little
Yeah.
kid, sort of yelling at the screen. But yeah, there is a lot of heart, and a lot of it, I think, is due to Russell Crowe's performance, which, I mean,
True.
this made it instantly a star. I mean, the gravitas and the star power on screen of him as Maximus is incredible. And it's not
Yeah.
only those commanding scenes like that opening battle sequence when he's, killing the Germans and defeating them, but it's those emotional scenes when he comes back
Right.
and sees his wife and son crucified. You believe that he is emotionally distraught, and he's sort of the only thing that is making him not basically want to die is needing to enact the vengeance on the people that did this to them, so then he can finally be free and reunited with them in the afterlife, which is super
It's
emotional.
very
And
moving.
it really is, honestly, like what his Maximus goes through in this movie for the honor of honoring his dead family. It really is like strength and honor, like his motto is, and that is what, again, is sort of like the in the beginning of the movie, that's the sort of the code that he has, and he sticks to that through the end. He easily could have thrown it away with what happened to his family and just said, "Okay, I'm done. I don't want to live anymore." But no, he has to enact vengeance upon them, and he does, even though he dies. But he still is able to get the comeuppance on
Right.
Commodus, who Joaquin Phoenix, also incredible performance. And it was
Right.
actually interesting. We recently did an episode on him, and this is the first time I'd seen the movie since we did the Joaquin Phoenix episode. And one of the themes that I picked up off in that rewatch of his movies was all, especially early on in his career, was the passed over brother character of, oh, there's someone better than me because his older brother got killed, died, and all these things. In this movie too, it's
There
right
too.
there. He feels like the passed over brother,
Literally
even though
there.
Maximus is not his brother, but it's clearly something Joaquin was wrestling with, at least in the beginning part of his career with this, and then Walk the Line too, with the older brother character sort of haunting him. I just thought that was a new insight that I had not gotten if it wasn't for our Joaquin Phoenix episode, which listeners can go back and hear if they want to hear my thoughts on Joker 2, a movie that I loved to hate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he's great in it. And I guess one last thing I wanted to add with the strength and honor piece and what's driving Russell Crowe's character, I think it's so clever in the script, but also in the performance of Jaimin Hansu's character, who's
Mm,
the other gladiator and friend. Like that relationship is just so beautiful and tender. And it's also a way for the audience to be reminded of why Russell Crowe is doing this, because Jarman often says, "Oh, so you're going to meet them there, right?" And he's like, "Not yet." And so there
right.
are these beautiful touches that remind you why this is happening, but it's done in a very sort of tender, emotional way. And in the end, when Russell Crowe's character dies, like Jarman actually buries a little toys of the
Hmm.
kid and the wife that he's been carrying. Like all these things are just so, you could argue they're a little bit on the nose, but I think you need that level of dialed up emotion in a movie like this that's epic in scale for it to land and kind of burst out of the Coliseum doors, right? And it totally works, I think.
Exactly. The scale of the set pieces are grand, but also that emotion, like you said, is grand too. Like the story really delivers, and the characters deliver, and the performances deliver too. So this also could have been arguably, well, I wouldn't put this as a masterpiece. I think the one that I have is stronger than this one, but it's right up there. For me, it's my second favorite film of his, actually, is uh,
It's
is
up
is
there, but like I
Gladiator.
said, to me, it's more and more a wild card because I don't see
Mm.
this anywhere else in his filmography.
So continuing on then to masterpieces, why don't you talk about your masterpiece for Ridley Scott? What is the film you bring to the table today?
Okay, so my masterpiece is The Martian from 2015, starring Matt Damon, Jessica Chastain, Kristen Wiig, like a giant cast. Quick logline: an astronaut becomes stranded on Mars after his team assumes him dead and must rely on his ingenuity to find a way to signal to Earth that he is alive and can survive until a potential rescue. That's a very long logline, but it is accurate.
That's the movie, yeah.
So we actually covered this movie in Movies About Work. So listeners can go and check that episode out. But I wanted to bring something from a more modern era to kind of juxtapose with your masterpiece, which is obviously one of the greatest, movies ever made. But I also think this movie is the ultimate process movie there is. And I'll keep harping on my theme here that Ridley is the director of process. In many ways, like the story of this movie kind of clears the way out. There are no other people. There's no character development needed. There's no relationship stuff needed between other people. It's just, how does this guy survive? And it's brilliant. It's arresting to watch. And it's perfect casting in somebody who's so watchable, charming, intelligent, that you would watch, just read a phone book, and that's who Matt Damon is. So I think this just works. It's a marriage made in heaven. And that's why this movie works so well. Of course, it has the great production value, the epicness in space this time of all of this coming together, but in a very fun kind of way. Like, this is a great pairing with something like an Alien movie, which, spoiler alert, that you're going to talk about, which is very dark and dire.
Mm-hmm.
There are dire things happening here too, but the tone is very fun. And they're clever things, right? From the kind of music he listens to, because that's all he's left with on the spaceship. Like, all of these things, the potato farm, him using his own poo to, bring that to life. And there's a lot of like tongue-in-cheek fun in the character, but also in the process, which is what makes this movie just so delightful. And it's super rewatchable. So yeah, that's why this is my masterpiece, because I wanted to have like the process movies of process movies there is for him. And this is what this is to me.
I'd seen this movie when it came out. We did talk about it on that other work episode. I think this movie's great. Like, so fun, like you said, and entertaining. I think it might actually be his most like balls to the wall, entertaining, quote unquote, fun movie that he's ever made, Ridley Scott. I mean, it's usually his movies are a lot darker in theme in some way, or serious. I mean, yes, this movie is serious in the sense of Matty Damon is stranded on Mars, and like, is he going to get home? And there's real stakes the whole time. Right. But there's just like there's a fun around this too. And the thing that I found interesting about this movie, the more times I watch it as well, is, one of the things I associate with Ridley Scott, other than like that theme I again said of like the main character getting tested and surviving, which obviously Matty Damon does in this movie, but there isn't a lot of visual like grandeur or the camera doing some amazing thing. He's really letting the acting and like the character and what Matt Damon's going through be the focus. There's not a lot of showy, I guess, in this movie. Except for the end sequence when he's trying to get back onto the spaceship at the end, which is harrowing, that, taking off from Mars and things like that. But I like how Ridley Scott in this movie has had some restraint, I guess. Like, he didn't try to inject any, again, wild sort of tricks of the camera, incredible special effects sequences, because the movie needs to be grounded just in what Matty Damon's doing. And he has the star power, Damon does, to be able to do that. And I love how Ridley kind of step back a little bit away. So he's like, you know what? I'm just going to let the story and the character shine through. And it does. Like, he's not trying to get in the way of that. And every time I watch this movie, I'm just respecting more of a little bit of restraint, I guess, in the approach of this. It feels almost like a paint by numbers approach, but that's on purpose, because you just want to follow the challenges that Damon's character is going through, because that's what this movie is. Like, each time there's a challenge, okay, he's science, so he has to use his rational mind, put his emotions aside, solve it, and move on to the next one. It's almost like the movie that is the biggest ode to like the rational mind, because it's like, get rid of all emotions. I need to focus on how do I solve this problem, or else I'm not going to
and that's why it's successful. It's Ridley, actually. And
in a way, yes.
That restraint also, I think, is just a function of the process and what he's going through. There's no other way to shoot this, I think. If there were, I feel like Ridley's going to find a way to make it bigger, but there is no way. But I still respect that he took that, because otherwise this thing doesn't work. I will say again, the Earth stuff and all the people, even though it sort of works, it's my least favorite part of the movie. You just want to stay with Matt Damon and see what's happening over there. But it's fine. But that's not the stuff I remember. And I almost feel like that movie, and then everything that's come since, where he's been doing these ensemble movies with lots of different characters, where each character is in like a different movie because of different acting styles. I feel like that is sort of starting here. It's not to that level. Like, they're mostly in the same movie, I would say, for the most part, other than Kristen Wiig, who I just have a hard time seeing her in anything but SNL, as much as I love her. I feel like it's just a bit.
Mm.
Of course, besides Bridesmaids, which is one of my favorite comedies, which I know you hate.
Right, I
But
do. Yes.
yeah, I don't know. That part is fine, is what I would say. But yeah, Matt's stuff is just absolutely amazing. And there's no time spent on his backstory.
Right.
He has a daughter at home or no, whatever. There's none of that. Like Ridley's not interested in this sort of stuff. And guess what? The story is doesn't have that. So again, perfect marriage.
Absolutely, and that's another reason why I think Damon works so well in this part because you just immediately love the guy. I mean,
Right.
he's like, your kid brother that you kind of grew up with. At least that's how I feel. Another thing to call out too, just because it's, this is a bit that whenever we cover this in the podcast, I just have to shout out curtain call credits. I love curtain call credits, and there's this movie has curtain call credits, so it always gets extra points for me at the end. I love how it ends like that because I don't know, it's like this again, this excitement and fun of the movie, and now we get to watch, all the actors do take their little bows at the end.
I agree.
Fun
That's
movie.
pretty fun. And I have to give credit to the screenwriter. Like I think he did a great job. And it's a very clever screenplay because it involves the viewer in Matt Damon's challenges and solutions. So you're very engaged and you're also solving with the character.
Hmm.
And I think that's very important for a process movie because otherwise the process would be too distant. And at some point you wouldn't care no matter who's on screen. But because you're almost kind of put in the shoes of the lead character and you're solving problem solving with them, it makes it a lot more engaging. So we've often said this, like often like masters, visual masters, they have to be paired with the right screenwriter. And that I don't think Ridley is a good judge of that with this guy Scarpa or whoever that he keeps working with.
Yeah.
Get rid of him. Bring someone like this to work with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Ridley's best films are the ones where it starts with like an amazing screenplay. I mean, that's kind of cheesy to say because every story is just out with a great screenplay, but a lot of movies don't, and they still work. But yeah,
Yeah.
definitely Ridley needs to have a solid screenplay that he can craft his vision around. And
Visual
this movie
storytelling.
is one of the best screenplays he's dealt with, and I think one of the best screenplays of like the last 10 years.
Okay, so what is your masterpiece? I think we're staying in space.
We are staying in space, but a different part of space, a much scarier part of space, because my masterpiece is Alien from 1979. The IMDb plot summary: after investigating a mysterious transmission of unknown origin, the crew of a commercial air spacecraft encounters a deadly life form. Obviously directed by Ridley Scott, starring Sigourney Weaver, Tom Skerritt, and John Hurt. So this was the first Ridley Scott movie I definitely saw, but like I said, I didn't really fall in love with him as a director, or really connect the director to this movie. But I loved this film from the first time I saw it. Very similar situation to you in the sense of I saw it in high school on VHS, not on a DVD. So the VHS was kind of
Mhm.
not the best quality, and it added to the atmosphere. And this is also a movie that growing up, adults would always say, "Oh, this is like a scary movie. It's such a scary movie." And you hear that, but, "Oh, The Exorcist is scary," or "Psycho is scary," whatever. Alien is scary is always in there. And this movie was scarier than it was in my head. Like sometimes you hear that and then you watch it like, "Oh, this is what people were like freaking out about." Like, come
Right.
on, like it's not really that scary. This movie to me terrified me when I first saw it, and still to this day when I watch it, it's still just so terrifying in terms of the atmosphere that Ridley's able to create here. And I really do think that is what really sets this movie apart in terms of horror sci-fi. I mean, Ridley takes this idea that George Lucas kind of created in Star Wars of a dirty lived-in future and makes it scary. Like the spacecraft is gross and old and slimy, and the camera slowly kind of moves. So I mean, I love the opening of this movie where
Hmm.
a lot of it's just establishing shots of the spacecraft, and nothing is there, but you're like, is there going to be something there? And then later on, obviously something is because it's the alien is there. But the way that he establishes this world as being this lived-in place that feels very real because of that. It's not like a shiny, beautiful future where there's this alien there. You feel more terrified because it feels more real for some reason. I
Hmm.
mean, this is his amazing production design and atmosphere that he's able to do at work in this movie. And again, the slow build that he does to the alien. The alien's not right there in the beginning. You don't really know kind of what's going to happen in this movie. That the crew of the ship doesn't even really know what's going on. Then he's able to heighten up the tension slowly, slowly, slowly until obviously there's the big reveal of the alien. And I think just one shout out to a specific scene that always gets me, and then kind of hear your thoughts in this film was in the first time the facehugger alien just jumps out of the egg and jumps on a John Hurt space helmet. It's sudden. It happens immediately, and then the camera quickly cuts to outside of the spacecraft, and it's like doesn't dwell on this at all. It's like quickly, it does not sting to the score or like horrifying moment. You don't hold on that and see him struggle with the creature. It just immediately cuts outside of this slow shot where it pans away from the spacecraft that they're in, and it just even more terrifying. It's like, wait, what just happened? I didn't, you're left with this feeling of like, okay, what's going on? What was that? All these questions, and that it's the uncertainty that is terrifying. And Scott just does such an amazing job with that and throughout this entire film. But that scene gets me every single time. I mean, I think this movie is one of the best movies ever made. Definitely a perfect movie. I've watched it dozens of times since I first saw it back in high school in a similar situation as you, which is pretty funny. But yeah, more thoughts on Alien from you other than your first time getting it thrust upon you by an older boy holding the remote. I love that story.
I'm being totally spooked by it.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I mean this is also a process movie for sure, but just a darker version of it and horrifying and totally holds up. I haven't seen it that many number of times, but like rewatching it after a long time was just everything holds up so beautifully in terms of special effects, the production design. But like you were saying, like the slow buildup of dread that's built from the very beginning, and then all the moments that happen that are meant to shock you, they really pay off in a big way. For me, it's the moment in when John Hurt is seemingly fine and they're all sort of having whatever dinner or whatever, and then the alien just starts to come out of him.
Yeah.
It's not so much of a surprise, but it still gets me because it's just you're fooled into believing that things are okay now. I don't know why I think that. Of course, it's the middle of the movie; things are not okay, but the way it's handled is just so masterful. I think what you were saying earlier made me think of this. This is another Ridley thing, other than the head chop, is this like very gross, grotesque, horrifying thing that happens in a very quick time frame. You have the Prometheus bird scene, you have Matt Damon, removing the glass, something like this very squeamish and gross, but it's done in a way that's just so sudden and not much is lingered and dwelled on, which makes this impact even stronger. And he's like a master of that. He does this over and over again, that it just comes out of nowhere and it's just so impactful. And the same is true for all the establishing shots and the way the spacecraft is shot, that I didn't feel an inch of sort of vanity or like, oh, look how beautiful, look how amazing, though grimy and grungy, the production design of the movie. It just didn't feel indulgent to me. It's actually very much part of the progression of the movie, that different parts of the spaceship are revealed to you. There are no like message cards or whatever to kind of give you a sense of, oh, this is that section, this is that section, and a chance for the director to kind of really linger and show you, oh, this is how amazing we made the whole thing. It feels actually very, non-indulgent, practical, to the bone, which also who Ridley Scott is. I think despite making massive giant movies, I don't think he's self-indulgent when he does that.
Absolutely not.
Which is amazing, actually. And then through the process of it all, once again, I think because the movie and the story lends itself, that an amazing character emerges. And I was blown away by Sigourney Weaver's performance in this movie. From the first shot, even when she's not saying much, just her sense of like something is off, or she's not given the authority that she deserves or wants. People are making bad choices, bad decisions. Although I don't know why we're after the cat. I just don't understand that. Amidst all the stuff, like I would leave the cat. I kept yelling to the screen, leave the cat, go.
You got to take something with you. There's got to be something to protect,
There's some things in the movie which sort of, to me, feel like they were done for like shock effect. Like the cat with Harry Dean Stanton, all of that. Or like the other woman who's like Lambert, who like freezes. I'm like, you probably went through space training. So you're not just an average Jane. Run. Why are you there?
Fair. It's a horror movie, right? Like there's got to be those.
There's got to be somebody.
And, yeah, Ripley's the final girl, so she's the one who makes it out. In the end with the cat. Clearly, there's a final cat.
I know.
too in this movie.
But it's funny to me that those things exist in a movie that feels so practical and lived in and
Mm.
serious, that maybe these were producer notes or what, that they landed on this. I'm sure there's a lot of literature and lore on this stuff, but those are some things that I'm like, oh, it's interesting to really entertain this stuff, because that doesn't seem like him at all. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's the horror, just classic horror elements that are placed
Yeah, but
inside of
when
this
is he
sci-fi
abided
trope.
by any of that? He just does what he wants to do. At least, or maybe he was younger then,
Right,
perhaps.
right.
Yeah,
And this was the only real sort of horror movie. Even though this isn't
true,
fully horror, it's sci-fi horror, but the only times he really tackled this
true.
genre, which is interesting, just again that I think he could lend himself easily to horror. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah,
just the horror tropes. But no, I think to the point we were talking about earlier too, around the screenplay and the characters. I mean, Ripley, there's not much on the page per se, but Sigourney's able to put such a commanding performance in there. As basically her first movie, which is also pretty incredible. And
yeah.
then the story is simple, but there's also a lot kind of going on. It gets into the class politics of it, of these are the working class that are
Mm-hmm.
going to exploit it, but the company doesn't care about them. They're expendable. They
Mm-hmm.
just want the alien for, more weapons manufacturing. So I like that this is not just a bare bones, B sci-fi movie where there's an alien and attacks people. There's a lot more going on in this movie too that even gets expanded upon in, the next two alien movies as well in terms of those themes. But I think this
Yeah,
movie just such a good job of that, just establishing these guys of just like, hey, we're blue collar, we're just hauling this cargo. We don't really care kind of about what's going on. Okay, fine, we'll follow the company orders because, they must care about us. And then, the twist is obviously they don't, the crew is expendable, just like companies think of their employees in that way. So I always
yeah,
like that there's, more going on here too than just
totally,
a horror, an alien in space. But yeah, this
totally.
movie still scares me to this
It's
day.
very, very
And
scary.
it's such a wonderful film. Like I had to put this as number one. This is the best movie I think that he has made, and no wonder it kind of stands the test of time and maybe is only beaten by the second one. I go back and forth between which movie is better, but they're both so good in such different ways.
Different ways, totally.
Yeah.
It's genre defining. You don't
Hmm.
have modern day horror. Not that I'm any horror expert, but whenever I can sort of see that all these movies are in dialogue with this movie. And I kept thinking about 2001. How could you not, right? When you watch a epic science fiction movie, and it's interesting to see like how Ridley Scott kind of stands up to Kubrick in his own way.
Hmm.
Like this is not an imitation of that at all. Like it has its own stuff on its mind, like you said, but also in the visual rendering of how things are shown. It feels very singular, actually, and
Agreed.
his tonality. He could have easily, not easily, because it's hard to copy someone like Kubrick, but he could have gone that route. But it really shows like Ridley's always had conviction in himself.
Definitely. It is genre defining, even though again it has bones of 2001 of Star Wars, but Ridley
Yeah.
just took this to made it his own, took those pieces and assembled them into something different that is now being copied and is influenced by so many different not only sci-fi but also horror films. I mean, it really is
Mm-hmm.
it is a masterwork. That's why it had to be my masterpiece. So now that we've gone through both of our masterpieces, let's get into our wild cards. This is where it might get a little more interesting in our exploration of Ridley's films. So, what is your Ridley Scott wild card?
Boof. My wild card is House of Gucci from 21.
So you have to do the Italian accent the whole
Oh
time. Maybe
my
we should both
gosh.
switch into Italian accents as we discuss
I
the
would
House of
get
the
we would
Gucci.
get canceled completely.
Oh no, mamma mia! Don't cancel me.
Okay. House of Gucci, starring Lady Gaga, Adam Driver, Al Pacino. What's his face?
Jared Leto.
Jared Leto. Quick log line: when Patricia Reggiani, an outsider from humble beginnings, marries into the Gucci family, her unbridled ambition begins to unravel their legacy and triggers a reckless spiral of betrayal, decadence, revenge, and ultimately murder. So I was one of the defendant of these movies when it came out. I watched it in the theater. I had a really good time. Everybody was up in arms about accents and accuracies or inaccuracies and everybody being in different movies and what have you. But I had a great time and I still do. I think this movie is very entertaining. The reason it's a wild card to me is that I think we've seen these themes, including in Gladiator II, of sort of politics and greed and ambition and Ridley's movies and revenge. Certainly, we've seen that, but I usually associate him with period that's either futuristic or prehistoric,
Mm-hmm.
or he's made contemporary movies as well. Like we'll talk about your wild card, but this is an interesting tale that is set in a period that's not contemporary, and it has like a different sort of sheen to it with money and fashion, and ultimately it's Lady Gaga's character story. I don't think he's made that many, of course, Thelma and Louise aside, that many sort of female driven narrative movies, though women often have interesting roles to play in his movies, I would say.
Absolutely.
Not always, but often. Even Ripley, like she emerges as the heroine much later in the movie, not in the beginning. It's a
Right.
very much an ensemble piece, and you're not really sure. But this from the first frame is Patricia Reggiani's movie, which is why I put this as a wild card. Does it fully come together? No. Is it flawless? No. But I think it's damn entertaining. It's beautifully mounted. I think, despite all the complaints people have, I think everybody did an amazing job in the movie, just given what they were given. I have some qualms with it, which I'll get into. But yeah, what did you think of this when you watched it?
I saw this also in theaters. Actually, the second time I've seen it. I've been wanting to rewatch it for a while, so I'm
Same.
glad I did for this podcast. I remember liking it in the theater, and I liked it on the second watch too. I don't I can see why it was getting called out and attacked, I guess, by the critics, and obviously the audience didn't really come to this either. I find it enjoyable. I think it's a fun tale. I think, at the time, and this is kind of also the case still now, there's this trend in Hollywood nowadays of making these like business movies, like, oh, how the Cheetos were made or how the BlackBerry, like that seems to be a trend. And this is essentially Ridley's take on that, but not just about this business tale of how the Gucci company left the family's hands and just turned into just a multinational corporation. There's a drama here. It is, to me, this is a movie about a family business. And when in the beginning of the film, this is a family business, and Lady Gaga comes in and essentially just makes it into a business. And what happens in that point, all the family pieces become less important. And Adam Driver's character is again put to the test with the new, his infatuation and love for Lady Gaga. And she sort of convinces him that we should run this like a business. Like, why are you doing all these things that don't make any sense? And you're just putting your family first. And then, yeah, he falls for it. And I don't think she comes across as like a gold digger or, yeah, she has ambition, but she feels honest to me in terms of what's driving her. She genuinely feels like this is not the right way to run the company.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the players involved, the Gucci family, they just care more about their family and the relations of their family than they do the Gucci business. And that is eventually what does the family business in at the end. I think this is a tragedy not only because Adam Driver's character is murdered in the film, but it's just sad to kind of see a family business and a brand that means something very personal to people get turned into just a brand name in this giant international luxury conglomerate of people that don't care about where the leather is made. I mean, I love that scene when Al Pacino's like, look, this is the farm and this is where the cows come from. And you can
Mm-hmm.
tell that these people genuinely love not only fashion, but it's like a part of them in these products because it's their name on the stores, but not in like a "my must protect my brand." It feels more like a member of the family to them. And Lady Gaga comes in as a brand manager would and say, no, we don't want these knockoffs. We should do this, which are all smart business decisions. I'm not saying she's not a good businesswoman. And the movie presents her as being smart, but there's tension with the family and it rips the family apart and then also takes the business into a way that just makes it, again, a name and an investor sheet as opposed to what it was. So that part of it's always resonated with me even more so in the
Yeah.
second watch. It's a tragedy involved in it. And yeah, you might say that the tone is a little silly and over the top in all performances, but I think that is what there's also a trashiness to the story, a
There
tabloidiness to the
is.
story that I think works. I mean, everyone works to me in this, even Jared Leto, who's someone who sometimes makes terrible choices. I think he comes across well in this, and I don't know. I'll defend this movie along with you. I think it's not Ridley's best, no, but it's entertaining, and I think there's a lot more of this message to the movie too. There's a tragedy in it that I just think is a very interesting take.
Yeah, I agree with all of that you said. That really comes through. I think where the movie, and other than the inaccuracies or the over performances or the accents, the inconsistencies, like I don't care about that. I'm sure the actors, I trust them, they did the work. Like, you know, Adam Driver's character, like he probably studied in London or other places, and there's a reason why his accent is different as compared to someone like Patricia, who comes from a working class family,
Right.
or even Jared Leto, who's never, I don't think he's left the country much. He's like a grown up baby who just stayed
Absolutely.
there, you
Yeah.
know? So I get all of that, why they would behave or act or speak the way they do. I think the problem is that everything you just said about ambition and greed and holding on to tradition, but then being swept away into doing more for the business and what's right and the cost that all of that brings. And then how at one point Patricia kind of becomes a lunatic. Like she hires a hired gun to kill her own husband. She regrets it
Right.
at some point, but she does it. Like she, and you really see how she, you know, she gets to that place. But I think the problem is that, as usual, Ridley's interested in the beats of the story and the process, but not so much in the emotional character development, where all of these things happen very quickly. And as much as the actors are doing a great job in communicating where they're at, it's just not given time to really breathe. It's not in the script because Ridley doesn't care about these things, you know? So when Adam is finally like, yeah, I don't want you anymore because you're annoying and gaudy and irritating and you just have taken the business in a different direction and he's not interested, like it happens so fast. You have to, as a viewer, you have to really kind of put the pieces together. Oh, I understand why he's behaving this way, or I understand why she wants to hire somebody to kill the husband. But it's just not let, like these are dramatic, like Shakespearean, even theatrical, operatic sort of things that are happening in this movie, but they're not allowed to really land on you in the right way, which again is a shame to me because this movie could be like a masterpiece because there's so much drama in here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, it doesn't come through fully. He just leaves all this for you to kind of put it together. I am glad that this is not a Ryan Murphy movie because that would be on the other extreme of things, which I cannot tolerate actually. So I'm glad this is here. I would rather watch that.
Yeah, I think the Ryan Murphy thing, I was watching this and I'm like, you know what? I think this in a way might have been more successful through his lens. I think to me, it was less about things happening fast, which they do. And sort of felt that was more that Lady Gaga's character and her performance is so good. The movie gives her so much time that Adam Driver's character and even their relationship sometimes isn't focused on enough because they are also not trying to deal with Adam Driver and their relationship, but the rest of the Gucci family. It's almost like
Right.
too broad of a brush they're painting. And if maybe
True.
better to do, if you want to include all these other characters, maybe you should make it a Netflix miniseries by Ryan Murphy. And if you want to make it a movie, maybe make it more about their relationship, Adam Driver and Gaga, and focus so much on that. Because I do think that his turn to be like, okay, I want to divorce you, let's live in separate houses, does seem very sudden. I buy
Yeah.
more into her evolution into actually
Yeah,
hiring those
I agree.
hitmen because I think the movie knows that she's more interesting
It's
and
her
they spend
movie.
more time. It is her movie, yeah. And that to me, it's more of like, is it an ensemble piece about the fall of the Gucci family? Or is it about this marriage where, the wife basically convinces or teaches the husband how to put business above family, which makes both crumble, his family and his business. Again, overall, the movie works for me, I think, more than it does for other people. And maybe over time, this will get rediscovered or have more of an appreciation than when it came out. Because I don't know, I was a little surprised it was so hated, I guess, or turned on. People
It was
turned
just
on it so
mocked a
much.
lot because it became a bit of a meme, right? With
Yeah,
all these lines and, I'm not an ethical person, but I'm fair. Like all of this
that's pretty good
stuff,
accent.
we live in that culture.
Yeah.
So hopefully over time, people will find, just more meaning in
Hmm.
it. But yeah, this is once again in a string of Ridley movies, like you're saying, like there's too many stories, there's too much and he's usually interested in one of those things or maybe two of those things and the rest of those things sort of fully don't come together, and this is
Hmm.
yet another example of that, although more successful I think than a lot of the other ones that he's done in this vein.
Agreed.
Also another example of like a weak guy who's kind of crumbled based on his sexual desire. Like I think that really lands. I think in the second viewing, I didn't clock on that in my first viewing. Like they are really horny for each other because he's shown as this like really simple guy in the beginning.
Hmm.
Like he's very bookish, actually. He's trying to sort of get away from all the stuff of the Gucci family. And she kind of really comes in and ignites something in him, which makes him feel like I have control and power, but actually he never did. He's like a bit of a weakling in some ways. So I kept thinking of Napoleon as well. Like lately, he's been playing with this, like how people who, wear this big mantle of success or brand name, they're actually, are they really that good? Napoleon obviously was, a master in whatever he
Yeah.
did, but there's a whole other side to him that's explored in the movie.
Yeah, I think, and on this rewatch too, and I remember at the time feeling this way as well, but definitely on the second rewatch, like you really buy their relationship. Like I
Yeah.
get why, there's a lot of chemistry between them. I get why
Yeah.
he would, even though as someone who's from a very wealthy and well-to-do and famous family, be with someone who's not. She's an outsider, but also I don't see her as someone who was just doing it because she wanted to be a gold digger. Like I see her
She
interest in him as a,
does.
I don't know. I don't really think
But
that's why
it's
she's
there's
pursuing
more
him.
layers to it. I think she seeks him out. She wants this life. She wants the riches, all of that. But then there's deeper. She does love him. She
Hmm.
does want the business to be bigger for her, but also because I think she finds a knack for the fact that she's good at it, or she thinks
Right.
she's good at it. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
it's a much more layered thing. But this is definitely a very ambitious gold digging person who's then driven to madness at some point, I think.
Well, madness because I think she lost someone who she genuinely did love. I don't think she was doing it just for the money. And I would think it maybe I associate the word gold digger with people who are just in it for the money. And yeah, obviously it's nice to be.
Yeah, she has
She
more on her
enjoyed the
mind for
wealthy, but
sure.
for her, I think it was more about the ambition of I think I can run this company and this brand better than the family can. And it maybe you could argue kind of she did because the company had a lot of financial problems throughout
Yeah,
that entire time. And by pushing him to sell the company, it didn't make maybe save it. I don't know how accurate a lot of this stuff is because I'm not super
true.
familiar with
Yeah,
the history here, but at least that's how the movie presents it. It's like, in a way, she's kind of right. But what do you lose in that? You sell your soul
right.
to the private equity, and then all the familyness and the heart is sucked right out of it because that's
Yeah,
essentially what happened.
yeah. No, I agree. She's not just after the money, but she's definitely.
Ambitious, yeah.
That brings us to our last movie. What is your wild card?
So my wild card is the Ridley Scott film The Counselor from 2013. IMDb plot summary: a lawyer finds himself in over his head when he gets involved in drug trafficking. So, directed by Ridley Scott, obviously, written by Cormac McCarthy, which I just want to call out here, his only screenplay, original screenplay, and starring Michael Fassbender, Penelope Cruz, Cameron Diaz, Javier Bardem, Brad Pitt. So, I'll get into the film in a bit, but two reasons why I put this as my wild card. I'll kind of bring that up first. I'd not seen this movie in the theaters. Financially, it didn't do terribly. It didn't do as well as people thought, and definitely the critics savaged it. Some people say, "Oh, the worst movie ever made, worst Ridley Scott movie ever made." So I did avoid it at the time, and it was on the rewatch of his filmography that I did 2 years ago. This was the one film that surprised me on how much I actually liked it. So I do
Mm.
consider this a hidden gem. And the second reason I think, again, having watched his films, that I feel this is a wild card for him as a director is it's by far the most like, philosophical film that he had. It's not really about the plot as much, not really about the characters. Really, there's barely any action and a couple, shocking, surprising scenes that do happen in this movie. But it is the only movie of his that really is just a bunch of characters talking about themes and philosophies of life, where characters represent that more than they do actual real characters. This isn't a movie about characters, it's a movie where essentially Cormac McCarthy musing on what is choice, what is free will, what is destiny, all these sorts of things. And Ridley has never been so philosophical before about any of this stuff. And yes, he signed up for this film before this happened, but during the production of this film was when his brother died by
Mm.
tragically by suicide, and they had halt production, and he came back to it afterwards to finish it off. And I wonder if that was part of just his ruminations on all these things about again what is life and loss and grief and all. So also themes in this movie too that helped him kind of finish this movie off or give more of his own personal soul into this film. I don't know. Those are just guesses. But again, he's never made a movie that is this heady. And I just was surprised how much I liked this movie and have seen it a couple times since then. And even on this rewatch, the director's cut each time, I will say too, I think that adds about 15 minutes to the movie, which the pacing helps a
Hmm.
lot. But yeah, I really like the intellectualism of this film. And I think it's a movie that people should check out and I think has been a little bit forgotten and I'd like to try to reclaim it. I'll talk more about the movie, but I'm just curious on what your thoughts were. I'd be surprised if you saw this in theaters, or maybe you did because it was kind
No,
of
I
hyped
totally
up.
avoided it, given what the
Same reasons
reviews
I
were.
did.
This is
Yeah.
the first time I watched it. It was on my list of movies to watch because I'd been hearing like conflicting reviews about the movie, which made
Hmm.
me curious about it. So I was happy to check it out. But yeah, this is a ride of a movie. I think I'm still grappling with if this is a success or no, but it does leave a mark on you for sure. I just couldn't stop thinking about the movie after I watched it. Even
Hmm.
though while I was watching it, I was like, what is happening? Who are these people? What are they speaking? And frankly, I was saying earlier that none of Ridley's movies are indulgent. This one feels indulgent to me because of this dialogue,
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
it just
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. But what it ends up doing after the fact is that it does leave a mark on you. And part of that is the dialogue, part of that is the shocking set pieces, but it's definitely a wild card in his filmography for sure. So I think this is a great pick. Yeah, it's a very strange movie. It almost feels like the off Broadway kind of play of sorts where people are just like you said, ruminating of things they stand for and believe in, and that's sort of that. But then this is obviously a Ridley movie, so it has giant A-list movie stars
Huge stars.
looking amazing, by the
Yeah.
way,
Oh,
across
yeah.
the board
Phenomenal.
in these like amazing palatial, wealth dripping settings and homes interspersed with really gory head chopping
Right.
set pieces. So it's quite the amalgamation of stuff. I don't think it works. I don't think it comes together, but it does leave a mark on you. There's and maybe that was the intent, like this is one of those movies that the more I think about it, maybe this was the feature, not a bug sort of situation. But watching it felt like this is a giant bug.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it worked when I first saw it, even though I didn't exactly understand what was going on half the time. I
Yeah.
mean, it is indulgent, but I think it is the screenplay and it's Cormac McCarthy's indulgence that Ridley is not pulling back on. It's not
Yep.
adapted, right? It's an original screenplay from Cormac McCarthy, who is a famous author, written a
Yeah.
lot of books, adapted into films like No Country for Old Men. Definitely a very negative and pessimistic view of the world,
Nihilistic.
nihilistic. Absolutely, and all that is bare in this movie where Michael Fassbender's character is this who's a counselor. He's basically a mob lawyer to these drug cartels, and deciding hey, he wants to have a big expensive wedding, so he's going to go in on a deal, and that's the choice that he makes. Even though everyone tells him don't make that choice, and then that choice ends up destroying his entire life and his wife's life and all these sorts of things. And throughout the movie, he's wrestling with this idea of, well, do I have any free will in this at all? Like once these things start happening and things start going wrong for him, he's kind of trapped in this death spiral essentially as the movie gets more and more pessimistic and more dark as it goes along. And a movie is asking like how much free will does he really have? I mean, he made the choice to get in on this deal, so there was choice in that. No one forced him to. But after that, all he's able to do is deal with the consequences of his own choice. So is that free will or is that determinism? That piece of it to me was what the movie's grappling with. And I
Mm-hmm.
think for me, at least on a philosophical level, that is a very interesting thought and interesting thing to think about of like what is really free will? What is choice? If we make a choice, but then we're trapped in this death spiral, is that free will? Or if I can't get out of it, is it really free will at all? Like these things are happening and he has nothing that he can do. And I think that to me just resonated a lot when I first saw it. And the more times I see it, that rumination that Court McCarthy is giving really do come through a lot to me because I just think about that stuff all the time. I don't think there is really an
Mm-hmm.
easy answer though. As a materialist, I definitely think a lot of it. There's a lot of determinism in there, and free will is much smaller at play than I think. Maybe Cormac McCarthy agrees with me too, because it seems like once these bad things start happening for Michael Fassbender, there's literally nothing he can do.
Yeah.
I mean, you know the writings on the wall, just how bad it gets, and gets way worse than you think. At least in the start of the movie, you don't think it's going to get this dark, and it really does.
Yeah, no, all that is very interesting, but because of the dialogue and the way the script is and the way it's even rendered, like nothing takes full hold in the sense like why are people doing this? Like it took me a while to even understand why is Michael Fassbender even entering this deal in the first place? Like what is the motivation? I kept thinking, is he and Penelope Cruz, are they even together? Is that a facade or a farce?
Oh.
And then suddenly you get the giant breakdown scene from him when, spoiler alert, she gets killed or whatever. I'm like, oh, so this was real. So it sort of is one of those like movies that lives in kind of like a cloud
Yeah, it's
to
very
me.
heady. It doesn't
It's
feel
very heady
realistic.
that none
Yeah.
of this sort of, and that's the flaw, I think, because you can have heady debates and conversations about things, but yet ground at least something in terms of character motivation. So in some ways, maybe it's the worst combination because Ridley doesn't care about that stuff anyway, as we've talked
Right.
about.
Right, right,
And
right.
you're now handed Cormac McCarthy's heady dialogue and indulgence, self-indulgence. So then this is the product you get.
Right,
Yeah.
he's not a director like a Terrence Malick that does he does a lot of heady things like this, right? Where it's very
In fact, Terrence
philosophical
Malick would be great for this movie because
and
then the plot will be gone
right,
completely and it'll
right.
just be this. But here, there is some plot happening, but it's not fully there. So then you're
Correct.
wrestling with what is that? So I would either remove the plot completely or introduce the plot and character motivations and have the heady discussion on top of that, which is a different movie.
Right, right. I mean, again, I don't think this movie is perfect,
No.
but it works. It works for me on what it's doing, and I think it deserves to be talked about and seen more. And I also
Yeah.
want to call out to Cameron Diaz, who's an actor who I've liked but don't always love. I think this is just a phenomenal performance, even though it is a little on the nose in terms of her literally being like she's a predator in this movie in terms of basically going after these helpless animal, quote unquote, like she's like a cheetah and they're like the prey, that they obviously allude to that a lot in this film, and she even has cheetah print tattoos on her back. She moves kind of like an animal, but I think her as a villain essentially in this movie, she is, but feels almost like this force of nature representing, again, this sort of her belief of like, hey, I don't miss anything, I don't want attachment because you can't change the past. Like the most nihilistic character in the film. Again, yes, it's a symbol and less of a character, but sometimes for me
Yeah.
that can be fine. I don't need characters in a movie like this, and I just think her performance really works for me. And even though there's some odd choices she makes, but I just want to call her out as someone who
She's
really,
great.
really works in this.
She's great in the movie, and with very little that's given, like she's able to create like a full character, which you really see. Although I read there's a lot of trouble, like she originally had like a Rihanna like accent because she's
Oh,
like part Jamaican, so she had to come in and redub the whole thing.
oh,
There's a
interesting.
lot of drama and trouble in the making of this movie, and one of the things that made her kind of quit movie making, I think this movie was kind of in the, if I'm not mistaken,
Oh, okay.
maybe viewers can correct me, it's kind of burnt her, I think, the way things were handled. But despite that, like I was expecting like a cartoon performance given what I had
Right.
read about the movie.
Hmm.
But like she's amazing in the movie, wields that power. I'm a huge fan of hers. Like she a brilliant comedic actress, people who have that kind of slapstick physical comedy chops that very few
Hmm.
people have in the body of this gorgeous leading lady who also has this kind of femme fatale sort of dangerous, and she can be vulnerable, like she can do kind of anything. After watching this movie, I was just so impressed by her.
Yeah, I think she's one of the strongest parts in this film. And you're right, this could have easily been cartoony, like a House of Gucci type of over performance, but she does it. She doesn't. I mean, maybe the Rihanna accent you mentioned was that, and they realized this
Yeah,
doesn't work in the
thank
film,
god.
and they dialed it back. But I think she does. She does a great job. And one other thing too that I just want to call out that I maybe could have talked about this at the beginning with Ridley Scott is another reason why I like him a lot as a director is he was one of the directors that have helped me sort of appreciate and seek out director's cut version of movies. He has a lot of them. Obviously Blade Runner's an infamous like 4 or 5
Mm,
cuts of the movie. But this, and I already mentioned Kingdom of Heaven, which was not a good movie, but the director cut is incredibly amazing. This is another
mm.
movie where I had seen the director's cut and heard about the non-director's cut version, just the pacing being a little bit off. So if people are recommending checking this out, I do recommend them seeking out the director's cut version of this because Ridley is definitely someone who goes back and tinkers with his films and says definitively, when I have a director's cut, that's the version of the movie that I want you to see. And this is another example of that. So if people are interested in, after we talked about this, seeking it out, try to find I think it's called the unrated extended cut is the official word for this, but that is The Counselor. So now that we've gone over our top threes, this is the part of the episode where we talk about, so what would you like Sir Ridley to tackle next in his filmography?
This was a hard one for me. Part of me feels like I think he should take a break. I think he's amassed this amazing filmography. And if Gladiator 2 is the last movie he makes, I think I would be okay with that, to be very honest with you. That said, he's obviously a force to reckon with, is not stopping. So if he were to make something, I would like him to make something that's a little bit more stripped down and see if what that looks like, maybe in the vein of The Martian. Doesn't have to be set in space, doesn't have to be a big epic movie, but something that's a little bit stripped down, has more character development. Like, I would love to see him try to do that, but I don't think he's interested in that. So I don't know. So what do you think?
I would categorize A Good Year, which is a movie we did cover in the podcast that I actually do really like, in that vein that some people didn't think it worked. I thought it did. Sort of a smaller scale character study. It hit me. So I would like, that would be fun, I think, to have him go back to something on that scale, though. Like, for me, it's a bit of the opposite. I think because he is one of the few remaining filmmakers that can operate on the scale of Gladiator 2. And again, that was a movie you got to see in theaters. It has a lot going on. Looks like it's $1 billion was spent on it, and it's all on the screen. And I want to see him continue to tackle, and maybe this is selfish because I love historical epics, but continue to tackle these. I hope he's just done two of them basically back to back with Napoleon and Gladiator 2. Maybe he's going to shift on to other things, but I'd love to see him continue to do this, go back in history. Doesn't matter what time. I love the sword and sandal stuff, but I feel like that he's been talking about maybe Gladiator 3. This movie didn't want to make me see a sequel. Gladiator 2, I was like, oh, I want the third one immediately. But I'd love to see him continue on this vein of historical epics. So maybe that's a boring answer because it's what he's been doing recently. But I just think it's such a rarity that of a director that can pull this off. And it's one of my favorite personal genres anyway, that I'd love to see him continue to work in this.
That's a good point, actually. I would like, and maybe he picks something from a different part of the world. In fact, I kept thinking of they're like epic Indian mythologies, which I know people will be like, oh, why is a foreigner directing an Indian mythology movie and all of that? But I think he'll be really amazing at creating something like that. So I think that could be pretty fun.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, other civilizations, right? That would be super cool. I mean, there's so many things to choose from there.
Yeah. Tell our listeners, what are we talking about next?
So next, we're also talking about another director who has had a long career, another director who is also not young. So we're recovering Clint Eastwood as a director, not as an actor, because he has a new film out as a director, not as an actor, called Juror Number 2. Really excited to talk about Clint. He's one of my favorite actors of all time and really means a lot to me as an actor. So exploring him as a director and putting the acting piece aside, I think will be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, it's been a year for sure of these old masters, coming back and sort of in their final chapter, if you will,
And hopefully finishing strong, all of them. But you'll find out what we think of Juror Number 2 in 2 weeks. So we hope you enjoyed your discussion today. Make sure to let us know in the comments what your thoughts on Ridley are, and also your thoughts on Gladiator 2 or other Ridley films we should have covered. So we're available here on YouTube as well as on all podcast platforms. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so. And also please rate and review us and like this video too, because that helps new listeners find our show and can hear our discussions. So with that, Karan, like you said, strength and honor. And hopefully everyone was entertained.